For today's video, we're going to be taking a topic that was suggested on our Discord, and we're going to be discussing about player customization and the different ways that you can give the player choices and kind of the pros and cons that surround them. Customization in any multiplayer-based game has been an essential element of not only the longevity of a title, but just in terms of keeping the player interested in it in the first place. And over this past decade, we've seen many games adopt customization along varying degrees. And that's a major part about our topic for today, that it's not a black and white case, but we can kind of go an entire spectrum in terms of no customization to full. And talking about each one of these topics individually is way too big for this. And if there's any part of this you want me to go into more detail about in another video, let me know in the comments. But when we look at how games have grown in terms of player customization, it pretty much comes down to allowing the player to have more of a control over how they play the games. On one end of the spectrum, we have no customization. So these are the old school games, Doom, Quake, Unreal, even sports titles as well, that any amount of customization is not directly in the player's control, in the sense of being able to fine-tune or change how somebody plays. In the old school first-person shooters, yes, using a shotgun is different than using a rifle or grenades or so on, but that's not really up to the player. Those are just items in the field. As we move further into customization, we then talk about games that allow you to create or choose from specific characters or classes. So this would be fighting games, the champions in a game like Overwatch, the first version of Team Fortress, and so on. In this regard, the player has legitimate choices. I can choose to be a heavy, I can be Ryu or Scorpion or whoever you want to be. But those choices are still hard locked by the design. How I play as Scorpion, I have the same exact moves as somebody else who plays as Scorpion, just as two heavies have the same characteristics in Team Fortress. Now, when we move forward even more into customization, this is when games allow players to alter or change how these hard locked or designed characters are. So this is when we get into the stuff such as being able to choose items in Team Fortress, the passives or talent trees in MMOs and MOBAs, and essentially even something as simple as the 3 or 4 different kind of styles you get from characters in MK. I think it was starting from 10 and now in 11. Now we're getting to things that get a little bit more interesting, because we have these uniquely defined characters, but how I play as one character can be different how you play as that same character. But the key point is that we're still dealing with designer features. Like, we do not have control over being able to change them. If I want to choose a different talent or a different rune that has otherwise been hard locked by the developer in such a game like Diablo 3, I don't have that opportunity. So then we get even further. And this is when you're able to kind of create your own character or adjust your character in many different ways. So this is when we have entire perk trees where you can pick and choose exactly how you want your character to behave. And this is probably even more in lines with something like Diablo 3, where you choose your class, you choose your skills, you choose your passives, you choose your runes for said skills. And in this regard, everybody's essentially creating their own version of this class. Again, we're still dealing with locked elements, but you are in complete freedom of how you choose it. And it's very rare to see two characters have the exact same build, unless we're talking about min-maxing. And then the complete other end of the spectrum, when we get purely into customization, this is when we get into this kind of modular design. Or in a way, it's essentially you are creating your entire playstyle. And this is something that we've seen a little bit more regularly over recent years. Call of Duty does this, The Division and Division 2 up there does as well, Payday 2 as we're going to come back to later in this video. And in this regard, I can choose my character's class, I can choose all the perks that I want to associate with that, I can choose my gear, I can modify or adjust my gear further. And in this regard, you have complete freedom. And this is, again, kind of like the holy grail when we talk about customization, because you allow the player to do everything and anything to this character. Now, the pro of that is very simple. The player, given free reign, can decide exactly how they want to play the game, and it gives them that freedom to, again, completely diversify themselves. And again, we're not talking about personalization, clothing options, colors, graphical effects. That's its own separate can of worms here. But allowing the player to create their own class, it gives them that much of an investment in their character. It's the same thing that we see with people who design decks in CCGs, or creating a popular build or equipment list or whatever in an action-based game. The downside, as any developer watching this knows, it's very hard to balance this kind of stuff. And the more control you basically give to the player, the less control you have from the design standpoint in terms of balancing and fine-tuning. Here's a game design quiz everyone can play at home. How would you perfectly balance 250 individual classes in a video game? That's a trick question. You're not. Most people would probably go insane once we get to maybe 70 to 100. It will be basically the sequel to that Black Mirror Bandersnatch episode, which if anyone wants to contact or give me them for Netflix, I can try and pitch it to them. But the more elements you kind of take away or take out of your hands, it becomes that much harder to balance the game. And this is why developers will typically try to compartmentalize some of these balanced choices and make things a little bit easier. In the Division 2, for instance, every gun in the game doesn't belong to its own class. Instead, they are categorized by specific gun types. So we have pistol, assault rifle, submachine gun, shotgun, sniper rifle, and there's probably a few other ones. And within each one of those classes, there are specific elements that are unique to it. If I remember right, they give each class its own unique kind of perk. And then we go further with the different classes, or the different kinds of, operator tools, wherever you get access to. And again, it's not about giving the player or creating 500 different options, but making a few specific ones and allowing for a fine degree of control within them. And this is considered to be the easiest way to do this. Now, with that said, though, the problem when we talk about having all these choices is that the more control you give to the player, the harder it becomes to avoid that sense of min-maxing. Again, it doesn't matter if you have 800 different gun options if only 4 of them are actually viable. In that case, you only have 4. And it's very easy to muddy the waters when it comes to these kinds of games when you throw all these different choices and abilities and powers and whatnot out, but the game is not balanced around them, either by making it game-breaking or that they just don't work at all. As with the classic RPG example of many games giving you all these kinds of crazy status effects and debuffs, and the enemies will kind of resist or just shrug most of them off. And this becomes even more challenging when we talk about multiplayer-based games. And again, we can even have its own topic of single-player versus multiplayer in that regard. Because in multiplayer, now you have somebody's finely tuned and optimized class and build versus another character's finely tuned and optimized build. So, who's going to win in that case? And again, that's a question that has a lot of different factors to it. And this is usually why when we talk about competitive or esports-based games, they will remove all amount of player customization. When we look at stuff like in esports, with games like MK11 and Injustice 2, what they basically said was, you can choose from the specific styles that NetherRealm implemented, but you can't modify them yourselves. Because then we're getting into more of those unknown factors. Now, I don't know if they do the exact same thing in League of Legends or MOBAs, because many of them have talent trees and a persistent element like that. If anyone wants to play those games, let me know down below. But we're going to switch to our second game, and I'm more going to spoil and say it's Payday 2, as there is another factor when it comes to player choice, and that is the more you give the player, the less of value, in a strange way, you're going to have overall. And I hope I have more footage of the game, because if not, we're going to just show something random. But first, a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom Patreon supporters and sponsors. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. As we said in the last part, one of the best examples of full-on player customization or class customization has been Payday 2. And this also represents one of the best and worst cases of how it can be applied to a game. Now, in the end of the last part, I said that as you add in more choice, it not only becomes harder to bounce, but it also becomes harder when it comes to providing a variety of viable tactics. And Payday 2 is a clear-cut example of this. The footage that you're seeing right now, this was taken about a year and a half, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. It's been a long time since I played Payday 2 on Death Wish difficulty, which at the time was considered to be kind of like the hardest possible version of the game. Since this video came out, they did add in the 1 down difficulty, which is basically the step above this one. But when it came to Payday 2, all the various mods, weapons, skills, perks, you name it, become less and less viable the harder you make, the harder the game got. And this is a very big point about balance, because if you have 200 choices, but again only 4 of them are really viable at the highest difficulty, then you really only have 4 choices to your game. And Payday 2, for the longest time, I think even to this day, even with the reboot of it, ran into this problem of balance. The issue is that the game itself is built on very specific and very focused builds in order to beat the game at the highest difficulty. And developers really overtune things as you get higher or as you go up in difficulty to punish players who don't know what they're doing or don't have the right builds in play. And it's time for a quick Payday 2, I guess, design lesson. One of the big things that high-level Payday 2 was all about was this idea of one-bullet builds. What that meant was because ammo is at such a premium in Payday 2, especially when you start running out of it and you have to switch to your secondary, a lot of the high-end play was built around modding your guns and getting the right perks so that your gun could kill a regular officer or a regular enemy with a single bullet. If you couldn't do that, then not only are you going to be wasting more bullets, but it means it's going to be hard for you to also deal with the special cops or the special forces. And this, in a nutshell, this right away, completely upended a lot of the mods and weapon builds that you could go for in the game. Because if your primary weapon couldn't one-shot these enemies, you were in a lot of trouble. So for myself, with a lot of the builds that I made for myself, I focused on high-damaging single-shot guns. I think I used the M308 primarily as my weapon, although I did use some of the smaller weapons for very specific or very crazy builds. But the point was, so much of the game's personalization or customization options were pretty much useless in this game at the highest difficulties. Also, As you're watching this footage right now, you're probably seeing some of the police officer in like that kind of blue and gray SWAT uniform. Those were enemies made specifically for Death Wish and One Down difficulty. It's basically a way of signifying that these guys are a lot harder than your normal troopers. The same goes for the blue quote-unquote Skulldozer that you saw a minute ago. But the point is that even though you have all these different skills, all these different perks and ways of customizing, it really doesn't matter at One Down, and I think they eventually retooled it to Mayhem, although I may be forgetting my terms, difficulty. So, this is the problem when you start throwing in all these choices, is that no matter how you balance it, you're always going to have quote-unquote useless choice, or useless choices. And Payday 2 was very much indicative of this. And it's not an easy solution, or there really isn't a solution in a way to do this. Because if you nerf choices, then your game's still going to be hard as heck to play. But if you buff all your choices, then that's not going to be balanced for the lower difficulties. If every gun could one-hit kill a police officer in Payday 2, then it's just going to make those abilities just not even be worth it to play, because there'll be no challenge. And it's, again, one of those choices as a developer you need to be really on the ball about in terms of balance. In some games, what they may end up doing, such as with the Division 2, is basically say that from levels 1 to 29, this is our balance and meta. At level 30 or endgame, we now move to this kind of design. And what they did along with Diablo was introduce this kind of gear level or gear rating system. That the higher you go, it kind of grades you based on your overall gear. And with the Division 2, and there's another game that does it, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. I think it was Vermintide 2, but there could be one other. That essentially they're saying is that if you want to play at the highest levels, you need to think about using the quote-unquote high-tier gear. Now, that high-tier gear is not going to matter at the lower levels, just because the game was not balanced at that difficulty for it. And this is an effective way of allowing you to have these two different kinds of balances. That one of them is meant for people trying to learn the game or at the easier levels, and then all the expert players are kind of at the high point. But again, that's not exactly a perfect situation, because you then run to that point of, okay, so let's say I'm at the highest difficulty, but I haven't gotten lucky with the right drops or the right perks, then I'm still falling behind everybody else, and they may not even want to play with me. And I've ran into situations like that where I'm in this kind of holding pattern of too high for the low levels, too low for the high levels. How do I gear up, or how do I get what I need? And like I said, there is no easy solution for this. And if Overkill ever decides or is able to make a Payday 3, they'll have to come up with, I feel, a more elegant solution. Because it's not about introducing more choices. This was an original point that they ran into. That they started to introduce the perk deck system and allow you to have the prestige system to let you choose more skills as well. And while that makes things more easier or makes things more powerful for the player, you're still running that situation of either I choose the best build or I'm a liability to my team. As another example, there is a point in Payday 2 that dodging was completely overpowered. With the right skills and the right perks, you could have, I think it was like about 50 or 60% dodge chance on all incoming bullets. So at one point, the best way of playing Payday 2 was literally have 4 characters running around the map with no armor on, dodging bullets, and dealing with the cops like that. One of my favorite builds was kind of the psychopath build that had me running around, avoiding bullets or avoiding damage. Any damage that came to me, I could hit enemies with and lifesteal off of them. And I just never went down because of it. And as we got higher up in difficulty and we got to that one down one, that a lot of developers like to have like a one life, before you get taken out, such as in World War Z, these kinds of builds became required because anything else really wasn't going to be viable. And I think this is also when this video was taken, was during those very popular dodge builds, as you saw that guy in a suit on the highest possible difficulty level. And this has been a major point, and it looks like YouTube's playing an ad right now. That's always lovely. Thank you, YouTube. But, as I'm saying while the footage gets back on, that this is how the competitive level play became in Payday 2. All the choices, all the builds, all the various guns and mods and all that didn't matter in light of just how hard it was to play. And if you didn't have 4 people who could play the game like this, you weren't going to win at this difficulty. And it became very frustrating to play for obvious reasons. Because you could do things right, but if your friends didn't have the right skills, they weren't able to, as we all know, get good, then it wastes everybody's time. And this is the dark side of customization. Because if we were dealing with set characters and set builds, there wouldn't really be any arguments. I'm the shotgun guy, you're the machine gun guy. Let's just keep our roles like that. But there are many levels in Payday 2 that you could only win or have any chance of winning at the most optimal way of playing, and anything else was going to get you killed. There's one mission that involves taking out a train, and the entire area is completely open. There's no real cover in it. So on the high civil where enemies can just basically hit scan you from across the map, you could be taken out and there is no way to tell where it's coming from or where or how to avoid it. And that is not very interesting to play. Because as we've said before, when there's only a few ways of playing your game, nothing else matters, it just gets very repetitive. And I'm sure with the footage that we've seen here or with playing Payday 2 more, that we could have done every map at one down difficulty or the highest difficulty. It would just take a very long time and would just get very boring to watch. And that kind of gameplay just doesn't interest me. With that said, to wrap things up for today, choice is an ever popular option for any video game in the current market, and it is required these days if you want people to have any interest in your multiplayer. But the more choices you try and give, the harder it becomes and almost pretty much impossible in order to try and balance that. And that becomes even worse if you're trying to do things at a high-end difficulty. That when there's only one or two ways of playing, anything that doesn't conform to that is going to be useless to you. So my question for those of you watching then is, how would you solve this conundrum? How do you give the player choice without making the choices too good or too bad that there's only a limited way of playing? Let me know in the comments below, but thank you for watching. If you'd like to suggest a topic for a future piece, please don't hesitate to get in touch and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. It's suddenly time to wrap up because I think my mouth is starting to dry out. Have a great night, folks, and I'll see you all next video. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.